Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Before we start, I'd just like to ask everyone to introduce themselves, please. And we'll start with our leader, please. Thank
Councillor Peter Fox.
Good morning, Councillor Liz Hackett-Payne, Cabinet Member.
I'm Penny Jones and I'm Chair of CYP.
Hazel Eilert, Scrutiny Manager for Monmouthshire.
Sarah McGuinness, Chief Officer, Children and Young People.
Steve Davis, Managing Director of the Education Achievement Service.
Nicola Allen, Principal Challenge Advisor for Monmouthshire.
Deb Mountfield, Head of Resource for Children and Young People, Monmouthshire.
Sharon Randall-Smith, Head of Service for Standards.
Right, would you like to introduce yourself, Mr. Cloud, please?
Keith Plough, Local Councillor and Mega Governor.
Stephen James, the Darson Director of Education for the Church in Wales.
Peter Farley, County Councillor for Chepstow St Mary's and Vice Chair of this committee.
Maureen Powell, County Councillor for Castleward and Abergavenny and a member of this committee.
County Councillor Peter Clark, member for Langui.
County Councillor Aaron Webb, a member for Tintern and St Harvens and a governor at the Down.
David Jones, County Councillor for the Criconi Ward in North Monmouthshire and a member of the Children and Young People's Committee.
Simon Birch, Chief Officer, Social Care and Health.
Tracy Giles, Head of Children's Services.
Councillor John Prosser, Chairman of the Council and Scrutiny Champion, observing.
Val Smith, elected member for Lambaddock Ward, here to observe, Chairman.
Thank you all. Just to remind you, use the microphones as you have just done, so that's fine. And the other thing, all phones off, please. Right, I think first of all we'll go to apologies for absence. Have we got any, please?
Councillors Harris and Councillor Guppy. Sorry, Councillor Blakeborough as well.
Thank you. Declarations of interest. As and when? Do you agree? Okay, thank you. Sorry, we're undertaking further scrutiny of the EAS, the Educational Achievement Service, and we welcome Mr. Steve Davis, the Managing Director of EAS, back to update us on information requested at the last meeting. There have been changes and positive results since then, so it will be to get an overview of progression. On a personal note, I attended the EAS Governor Conference on Saturday, when some of the issues being raised today were discussed and clearly addressed, for example, challenge advisors and categorisation. And with this in mind, Mr. Davis, are you ready to discuss the issues carried forward? And could you identify the points for clarity, please?
Certainly.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for having me back again. After my first experience, I thought I'd bring some reinforcements with me. Nicola's here to respond on some of the issues that and we can and in response to additional questions may have more detailed information than I have. So it's to help you. The first question really was the extent to which the new SIMS is up and running and whether there is consistency in its application. This is about the electronic system for collecting pupil-level data, targets, and data in terms of what pupils achieved. And the concern was the interface between your SIMS system and how we centrally collect the data. And this hinged on real challenges last year for schools who had real problems. They did the hard work of judging what children they expected children to achieve. When it came to the interface with the IT systems that we had, it caused them a good deal of distress, and we apologise for that and look to make sure we put it right. We have put the systems in place, as I said, in the summer. We trialled it in the summer, continued to trial it early part of this term, and we are confident that we will not have the pitfalls. We've worked closely with all 5 SIMS teams within the 5 local authorities. We've tested the output of data to our central services, looking for glitches. We continue to run clinics and courses for staff, because in some cases it's the administrative member of staff who's doing the input. In others, it's the head teacher or a teacher, to cover as all bases, really, in terms of giving them the confidence that, as I said, when they've done the hard work of crunching the data, that they're in a position to smoothly transfer that data in. More to that, I committed in the summer that in addition to the annual event of setting the targets and then receiving the outcomes in terms of the final assessments, through constructive challenge from the 5 directors and lead cabinet members for education, were challenged us on, well, we were getting some surprises and shocks at the end of the year. We need to have a stronger idea of the expectations of the school. Do they change term on term? So we have no surprises or fewer surprises. So we agreed a process where we would use the similar process, the same system and a similar process to update interim judgments if there were any marked variations from what the school was predicting at the beginning of the year. While this adds a small amount of additional administrative task for the school, it does give us, and more particularly you as councils, stronger indication of progress towards achievement. This system also enables it to be collected reasonably smoothly. That said, we are continuing to look to refine the process, because Monmouthshire, not unlike some other authorities, the number of teachers, head teachers, and the access to SIMS and the power of the IT systems are still causing frustrations. So we are continuing to look through this year with the councils to improve the quality of that management information system to make it even easier for for teachers to register pupils' data, but also for local authorities to scrutinise by school and by sets of data within school, both at the beginning of the year in terms of expectations, but as I said, on a termly basis to see progress. I'll stop there for any questions, Chair.
Are there any questions on that specific issue? No? Okay, please continue.
The next question was the picture post-restructure, whether we have secured a greater consistency in systems leaders and challenge advisors. Well, you were setting me a challenge, because the first meeting I had down was early in September, and that would have given me a couple of weeks, and Nicola a couple of weeks to be into it. That said, we had done some pre-planning in the summer about structuring meetings with directors, and also structuring the work that, because you'll recognise the key planks that we put in place for consistency for Monmouthshire was the appointment of a permanent principal challenge advisor, which is Nicola, and then a smaller team of people who fundamentally did almost all of their work as challenge advisors within Monmouthshire. So you had that consistency and a team that could respond quickly and could be brought together and work more effectively with your officers, whether it be in ALN, finance, in other areas. So those structures were set in place. Since then, my assistant director, Debbie Hartfelt, has visited and met with your director and with senior members of your staff, with Nicola, to plan out the interface of meetings, the sharing of information, the processes by which you quality assure, or that your officers over and above this scrutiny quality assure what we do, and it's fundamentally through the work of Nicola. We have started the year in terms of consistency with some significant training for the new challenge advisors. That we used to call them systems leaders. They're now challenge advisors. And one of the most important parts of their job is to support the local authority in the categorisation of schools. You would have heard historically of banding for secondary schools. It's a classification of schools in terms of performance. As regions, the four managing directors, we've worked closely with Welsh Government to put in place a system that has resulted in banding being removed. It is called categorisation, broadly similar across primary and secondary schools, and there are 3 steps to it. The first step, and this is the area we were covering significantly with governors, because it is important to governors, but it's important to members to recognise the importance of this, because this will get into the public domain as we move forward, and the classification of schools into 4 categories, primary and secondary. So the job is to, first of all, stage 1 is to receive the performance data from a central Welsh Government. And that's a bit like Computer says. You can't argue with it. It's 3 years worth of data as opposed to 1 when we had bandings. You saw massive shifts sometimes. You saw your schools in here and in other parts of the country, some anomalies where schools would move from band 5 to band 1. And what we wanted to look was progress over time, but we wanted to supplement it with a degree of moderation. So there's a step 2 and 3. The first one is, this is your data and this is what it's saying. And at primary level, it's key stage, it's teacher assessment, so a foundation phase, and key stage 2. At secondary school, it's key stage 3 teacher assessment, GCSE data. In both phases, attendance is another critical figure. And that is interesting, actually, because I've looked at the initial categorisation, they haven't been published yet, for primary schools. A number have performed very well in terms of some of the teacher assessment, but the attendance has actually dropped them the category, and I think that will increase in relevance. So that categorisation has 3 phases, and this is why the challenge advisor role is so critical and we need consistency, because the second phase is the school has a set of published national criteria of what there are 4 categories, green being the highest performing school, yellow, orange, and then red. And it defines what a green school looks like in terms of leadership and teaching and learning, with a number of features that you can access by discussion, by looking at school systems, look for their own monitoring of teaching and learning, talking to teachers, talking to pupils, but there are ways in which you can access making a judgment against those 4 categories. So you might have a school that on performance comes out in the top category and yet comes out yellow in the self-evaluation and judgment on the capacity to improve around leadership and teaching and learning. There are reasons for those anomalies. One of the key ones is the validity of the teacher assessment in primaries in particular. Whereas in secondaries you've got externally marked assessments, examination boards, the degree of moderation and the process of reaching the teacher assessment is less moderated, less challenged. And if I'm honest, across Welsh Government, across the regions, across local authorities and across schools, there's been some inflation because everyone's chasing, as you were with me last time, how much have we improved in this area? And as the moderation is not strong, and this is across Wales, it's agreed that we need a tighter system of moderation. And one of the ways of moderating that within this process of categorising a school is to say, for example, if their teacher assessments were at this level and the reading tests, which are not part of the categorisation of schools, point to some very different. Now, there will be some reasons why there will be some differences. There's some marked differences. We'd look at how the school moderates and the confidence that we have in the portfolios of work. So the first stage is to take the raw data. The second stage is to test and evaluate, between the challenge advisor and the head teacher, and with engagement with chair of governors, maybe others, you reach a judgment. That judgment, the third stage, goes through to the local authority for ratification. And then fundamentally, as of next January, all schools in Monmouthshire will have a category, and it'll be a colour of those 4 colours, and that will be one of the main determinants of how much focused intervention those schools would have. The core, what I call the core, and I'll come back to this when I talk about the finance structure and the budget for Monmouthshire. But there's a schools who are in the red zone will have a targeted intervention plan, agreed with the director, monitored by the lead member for education, against a statutory requirement for national government for schools causing concern. So there is intense intervention and support. With that comes some of the pressure with the school to rapidly improve. If it's a school in orange, it will still have an intervention plan, a support plan. It will not have, not in all cases, but in most cases, it's unlikely to have an intervention plan on the scale of the red schools. But that's not definite. There may be some schools in orange, so we need that. But there is still an expectation of progress as those schools will move through orange and into yellow and then onto green. But there is a national set of criteria against which the schools will be judged and categorised. The difference between secondary banding and the categorisation of both primary and secondary is that with the banding, they in the first year they set the percentiles, so you've got roughly the same number of schools roughly in each of the areas. So what it meant was if one school really improved a lot and the other schools stayed the same, by improving you knock schools down. What we've agreed with the Welsh Government is for 3 years the boundaries are set. So if you move up above a boundary, it's not at the expense of pushing others down for those 3 years. So all schools can be seen, if they improve, to actually progress. But the importance of the consistency of the challenge advisors is that we ensure we have the systems to monitor and evaluate and support them. Now, Nick's going to touch on what she does, well, what's been done to date from the beginning of this term on the training and development, materials used, then how she works with them on reports, visits, and to secure and give confidence back to the authority that actually they're fulfilling their role.
Thank you. In terms of ensuring the consistency, Steve's given you the very overarching big picture strategic level, but how do we ensure that actually every single challenge advisor is a good challenge advisor, and how do we ensure that they're consistent across the piece? Steve referenced the fact that we did 5 days of training at the start of the term, and we've set up very, very similar paperwork templates and procedures for everybody to work to, in addition to 2 days of Welsh Government training that went on early on. On a practical level and on the ground, what does it mean? A series of things, really. One is that challenge advisors and partner challenge advisors we haven't really touched on, who are perhaps head teachers in post who will work with other schools as well, would come and shadow me on a visit so that they could see, in order to attain consistency, how does it actually work, and what questions should they be asking a school and what evidence should they be looking for. So they'd shadow me. I will go out and QA each of the challenge advisors' visits to schools. So I'll select during the next term to 2 terms 1 visit to go alongside them and see how they work with a school. And everybody's report that they write about a school and their categorisation comes through to me to originally be QA'd. My first 3 then go to Debbie Harteveld as Assistant Director, so she quality assures the quality assurance process that I've done. There'll be a regional moderation of our decisions, so that you can have some surety if we've said it's orange and it's in Abergavenny, that somebody in Caerphilly who said it's orange, that's similar, and the evidence basis for that is good. There's then a national model of moderation. So it'll go to a national board and we'll select a series of case studies and evidence, and actually we'll then have some surety that if it's orange in Wrexham or in Anglesey and it's orange in Monmouthshire, that those schools are similar. I suppose the most important element that comes out of this is what's the bespoke support plan for the school, because it's not just about sticking a label on a school and walking away and saying you're orange, could you sort it out? It's about the level of support. And our direction from Debbie and for us as principals is very clear. If we have any element of caution on a school being between the two boundaries, we'll err on the side of caution so that we can ensure the school gets the support and moves quickly, rather than thinking, oh, it'll probably be all right. And actually they may not move as fast as they can, and schools could get left behind, particularly with fixed boundaries. You wouldn't want any Monmouthshire school, if it was on the cusp between two, to be left behind by schools that had been well supported and then drop down a year. I'll leave it there because I'm sure we've got lots of questions for you to come back to us.
I'll just add a couple of things, very quick things, Chair, if I can. First of all, we are in a massively different position now in terms of being able to do this than we were 2 years ago when I set up the EAS in 2012 and you had the inspection, or we had the inspection in October. We started in September. So in terms of having a grip and a knowledge and a finger on the pulse of schools, when Estin asked those questions, do we know the schools and do we know what we're doing about it? We're in that much stronger position. And allied to that, you will know that the authority, and as a result of the authority, the EAS work closely now with Estin to accelerate out of the special measures, and we are working very closely to get to that position. So Nicola's role, as well as supporting the consistency beneath her and working to my assistant director, Debbie Hartfeld, Nicola is also working closely with other officers across the council, doing joint presentations to Recovery Board, and when we get to meet with Estin, as we move forward, as they come to visit us again, that we are able to consistently say, yes, we're being challenged, appropriately challenged by you and by officers, but there's also collaboration, because there are things that you're doing that are outside of school improvement that impact on school improvement. Your planning of new places, your new schools, your ALN. There are things that where there would be crossover.
Mr. Davis, I thought what we'd do is you go through all the bullet points and then questions to you and Nicola at the end, if that's all right. Okay.
The next question focuses on, I made rather a bold statement in the summer. I didn't realise the press were here at the time, and said that you'd have your best set of results ever. It was a bit daunting when I went online and saw the South Wales Argus report. Your results, you would have seen them in the press. These are still unverified, so there will be some areas for but they will be very, very fine in terms of shifts. What I'm going to give you is for each of the categories, what the level of improvement has been within Monmouthshire. These are the key stage 4. What the indicative figure is for the level of improvement in Wales, and what the level of improvement is within the region. So it's across the 5 councils. So you get a sense of what has happened in this last year in Monmouthshire. Then I'm going to put it in the context of, well, where do we go from here? Because there's lots of good news, but there's more to be achieved, and I'll share some of the evidence of that as I come towards the end. So first, your improvement at GCSE level 2, including either English, Welsh and Maths. So it's the figure that Welsh Government use on the whole now to have the most important area of measurement for them in terms of level 2 inclusive. So you've got 5 GCSEs which include either English or Welsh and mathematics. In Monmouthshire in 2013, you were at 57.3. You are now at 65.3. So you see that level of improvement. Across Wales, there was a 2.4% improvement. And across the EAS, there's a 3% improvement. So you see Monmouthshire much higher than Wales and higher than the region. Every local authority in the region improved. Nobody went backwards, but some improved more than others, and Monmouthshire was by far and away the most improved authority. For level 2, which are the GCSEs, but do not, were for those pupils who achieved 5 but didn't get either English or maths, or didn't get both, the improvement went from 74.2 to 85.8, so an improvement of 11.7%, against the Welsh average improvement of 4.2%. So you get almost 3 times the level of improvement. Across South East Wales, 5.7% improvement. For level 1, where these are pupils who would have gained the GCSE qualification, you're very high across the country in the region, because there, even in 2013, 92.2% of pupils were achieving level 1. This year it's gone up to 95.6, so an improvement of 3.4 against the Welsh Government improvement of 0.6, sorry, 0.6, important putting that point in, regional improvement of 1.4. If we look at the differences between English, mathematics and science, the biggest rate of improvement was in English, where Monmouthshire improved by just over 8%. This was an area where you will know earlier in the year there was a great deal of worry amongst parents, amongst children over their GCSE English results. Across Wales it improved by 3.1%, and across the region it improved by 4.4%. Mathematics was less of a level of improvement. In rounded terms, it was 4.2% improvement in mathematics, but that was against a national improvement of 1.1%. So proportionately, it's similar to the level of improvement in English proportionately, but at a higher number. 1.1 across Wales, and this is the only one where the region scored below, which was 0.9. And so improved, but not at the rate of Wales, and certainly not at the rate of Monmouthshire. And then in science, I only have at this stage the level of improvement within Monmouthshire, which was 6.6%. So what that points to is good levels of improvement across the region. There was high aspirations among schools. Some of the targets, well, a good number of the targets were not met. They're very ambitious, and we have to look closely at that with the council this year to make sure we get the balance right between rightly aspirational but also being realistic and seeing what impact that has on what teachers do and what head teachers do. I won't go into the detail of what we use benchmark data in quartiles to say, well, it helps us look at where a school is in comparison to schools like it across Wales in relation to free school meals. So rather than look at a school in raw terms against other schools, it looks at similar schools with similar characteristics, and it puts them into 4 quartiles, 4 groups. If you're in quartile 1, you're performing at the level, the top 25% of schools like yourself, or like that school in terms of those characteristics. If you are in the 4th quartile, then you are in the bottom 25% of schools who have those similar characteristics. It's really encouraging in terms of, because always the question asked of Monmouthshire is you can't rely on raw scores, because you would expect pupils in Monmouthshire to be scoring at a high level, but how do you compare with others? And we have moved significantly into the upper quartiles, almost sort of 3 of the 4 schools in, and it's not always the same school, 3 of the 4 schools in all of those categories hitting quartile 1 or 2. Some have slipped down, have moved from 4 to 3. And that's why I believe, and we believe, there's still scope, and the schools believe there's still scope for improvement, because we aim for the top 25% for all of our schools across the region, and clearly within Monmouthshire, which is you would aspire to. So, in short, good improvement and encouraging. Schools delivered it. We supported them with the authority. We're not complacent. I don't believe the schools are complacent. They have the data which shows them that they still have a way to go in some areas if they're going to achieve the ambition, your ambition and their ambition, about the top 25%. So the foot won't come off the gas. The congratulations have gone in. The support has gone in, and will continue, because sometimes you put support in and there's sometimes a bit of fragility around an area. So we're not looking at taking away all the scaffold, some of which we put around some of the parts of the school, not physically, but metaphorically. So we will continue to look to support, and then on a termly basis now, which as I mentioned earlier, the authority should be given confidence that the progress towards targets, or they're given a clear rationale if there's an indication that in some areas the progress is not as much as one would have expected. And then critically the question from the authority, well, what are we doing about it? Not waiting till next August. I'll stop there, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you. Any questions at that point, or would you like Mr. Davis to go on and do the specific breakdown of the financial picture first?
Okay.
Shall we do that? I think so.
Yes.
Thank you.
Specific breakdown of how the 69k is to be spent. First of all, for those who are not here, there was an underspend of about £600,000 in the overall budget for the EAS last year. That wasn't all from the core budget, because the EAS has a significant amount of resource which comes from grants which are retained to spend on literacy initiatives and numeracy initiatives, foundation phase. Some of those grants require, well, the grants require all of the money to be spent in that year, where there were some areas where it was legitimate to spend all of that money. We still were left with a figure of £600,000. Now, we agreed, the budget for the EAS is agreed by the board, and you have had a member on the board previously, your council leader. Of late, a new member of the EAS board, Councillor Greenland, and that board receives and approves the budget. And they challenge us in terms of spend, and challenge us through the year in terms of where we haven't spent. We took the rationale for the underspend through to the board, and what was agreed was that there were 3 areas that underspend could be allocated to. The first was staffing, and I'll come to the detail of the question in a moment, Chair, but I've just got to set the context here. The 3 areas are staffing, and that is we inherited a structure of 5 local authorities that had been brought together with a good deal of duplication in some areas and a high level of challenge of the new roles that people were moving into. And that resulted, first of all, a level of churn. It did impact on redundancies. Because I touched on last time I was here, the decrease in budget and increased efficiencies. I happen to think at that time that there were scope for reduction of posts, but you know, as members, that comes with some initial costs that gives you savings over time. So there were staffing costs across the whole of the region. Some of which cross the financial year. So when you start a process of redundancy, then that negotiated period, though that process of time is not always a quick period, that you can, it sometimes becomes more protracted than one would want. And that passed over into the new financial year. The indicative costs around those staffing issues, which were related to redundancy, and in some cases termination of contract, and sometimes termination of contract also comes with costs, and I think officers would be well aware of that. So the indicative costs across the region of those were in the region of £100,000. So the approximate costs in terms of the contribution from Monmouthshire was in the region of £13,000. These are indicative, they're not precise, because in some cases, when I go on to the next stage, you'll see that we have not finalised agreement on the actual spend, because we're still halfway through the year on the second 2 items. The second one is the management information system, which is a refinement of what I talked about in terms of the link to SIMS, but it's also an extension of that to support schools in the requirements around, new statutory requirements around school development planning, spending of their SEG, which for some schools runs into hundreds of thousands of pounds, and how that links to their monitoring and evaluation, and how that links to categorisation. So there is still a planned expenditure, and there is an activity being developed with directors and scoping around what that would look like when that will happen in the remainder of this financial year. And that would cost in the region, around the 69,000 would be in the region of about £25,000, that contribution. The third area, which I explained to you last time in depth, was the area around school-to-school work. And from your 69,000, I'm sure most of you have done the maths and would have it at about £30,000, a contribution to the school-to-school work. And this is only part of the school-to-school work that we are required or expected to do through Welsh Government. And this is the work where, across the region, there are some schools who are doing exceptionally well at an aspect of leadership or teaching and learning, where we give that school some additional funds to free up their staff and their resources to either work in an outreach way with other schools, or the schools visit and engage with that school and see that work in practice. The reason we have shifted significantly to that model is because it is the best way people learn. You don't, as I said to you last time, you don't bring them in and inject them with some literacy and numeracy and expect them to go back and, teach fourth. Or, you don't give them a leadership course, go online, and all of a sudden you actually know how to apply that leadership, that learning. So that is a simplistic explanation with it, but it comes with some costs. The next stage in the development is one where, at the moment, for the early stages, what I call pump prime. We invest in that. The next stage, and we're at this stage moving forward with 2 or 3 of our programs, where the school themselves become the salespeople for that program. So all we do is broker between this school has the skill set and capability to deliver leadership, teaching and learning, maybe aspects of literacy, numeracy. We put them up as accredited providers, then the schools spend their SEG money purchasing from that school. You then ask, well, what happens to the money that you put in to that school? We either shift it to Pump Prime, a new model, or in this case, which is what I'm coming on to, when we are forced to make budgetary decisions around cuts, we have to look across the board, and where we have to make cuts quickly, and this is one in this area, because you'd have seen in the press, we have an in-year cut across Wales of £5.2 million from our grant, our SEG grant and our Ethnic Minority Achievement grant. What that means for the region is something in the region of approximately £800,000. The SEG money, as part of our grant, has to be looked at and shaved, and most of the SEG sits within the EAS because it's about school effectiveness. There's some money for monitoring of grant that sits in the local authority and the EAS, but the great majority of it, so we have to look at that. So those were the indicative figures of where we would be spending it. 2 of the 3 still stand. It is likely that the third one, the 30,000, will be required to make contributions to the saving that all 5 local authorities will need to make with the region as a result of the grant cut. Shall I move on to the next point, Chair?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Show a specific breakdown of the financial picture down to unit cost to clearly show how Monmouthshire money is being spent. I can and will give you the breakdown for your core money, your I think it's 400 and something thousand pounds, and that money is split between challenge advisors, the literacy programs, the numeracy programs, and governance. And that will cover, in addition to our accommodation costs and your contribution to that, and the management costs of the EAS, I will give you that breakdown. And it covers all of your core grant. The areas of slight overlap, you'll have that money, and you look at you have the bodies in terms of the challenge advisors and their salaries and on costs, and everything will go with that. But there's a lot more that Monmouthshire gets from the EAS that outside of that core grant that you will want to know and get an indication of, well, what proportion of that are you getting? And I'm thinking particularly around the courses that are run through the retained and the school-to-school work around the School Effectiveness Grant, the SEG. So even though there's 800,000 coming off it, there's still millions of pounds there that comes into the region. Now, we look to refine the value for money model as we're working through this year, but I've got the figures up till April of last year to show you what is it that Monmouthshire is getting out of that provision that's different to the other authorities. And your contribution in percentage terms to those grants and the core fund is around about 12.6%. So the amount of money that Monmouthshire either puts into the pot, its core fund, or the funds related to grant, the indicative area is 12.6%. We have time management systems and data on attendance at courses. The time management gives us visits to schools for literacy, numeracy, the systems leader, now to be the challenge advisor. So we've got the figures that we can give you. I can give you now in terms of the percentage of schools, teachers and head teachers from Monmouthshire who've accessed this provision. So of 100% of the provision for leadership training, development, seminars, conferences, Monmouthshire has taken 15.6% of the places. So against 12.6 contribution, it's taking in 15.6. In terms of the visits, that is the time spent by challenge advisors, systems leaders historically, Monmouthshire was receiving 18.3%, well above its what would look at in terms of its contribution. Bear in mind, last year there were significant interventions in a number of areas. I'll come back to reviewing this year's data in a moment. Foundation phase in terms of attendance at courses, 22.5% of take-up. Welsh and Education Grant, 14%. 21st Century Learning, the EAS, 17.2%. That's the ICT development work. The brokerage and intervention, that's a lot of the intervention programs that were added in terms of where a school had a particular challenge. So, for example, King Henry's English department, for example, needed a structured program over a number of days, over a number of weeks. The brokerage and intervention, Monmouthshire had 23.7%, almost twice that level. Now, I use these figures guardedly because if I'm giving you these figures here, then I'm going to other authorities showing that they're at this stage. Some of this is to do with take-up, demand. Some of it, like brokerage intervention, is to do with active intervention. There is one area where the demand for support and attendance at programs around literacy was at 10.5%, which was below that, and I've asked colleagues to look into that. The literacy team have looked into that. Some of it is around the schemes that are used within Monmouthshire, and we're exploring that, and we're exploring it with the head teachers as well, and the power of having the opportunity to have a Monmouthshire team to explore that adds to the benefits. Where we look to get to, so first of all, I will send you that indicative figure, Chair, and you can circulate it to this group.
Thank you.
But where we will get to this year is a value-added model that we are taking through directors at the moment, which builds it up from each school and will give the director and members access to what is the challenge advisor categorise the school for this year. So if it's, let's just say it's an orange this year, and it's agreed it's an orange, what is that challenge advisor's prediction for where that school will be next year? And we're splitting it, while in the category, we're splitting that each category into 3, so we're having sub-levels in terms of progress. Then we will monitor by individual schools, what are they accessing to make that difference? So if they're an orange and they want to become a yellow, then they're going to do some work around leadership, teaching and learning. They're going to be, might be part literacy, part numeracy. And we need to be secure that they're accessing that. And then the challenge advisor knows he or she is responsible for tracking the progress of that. They'll have the termly data towards some of the outcomes as well. And it will also allow for the local authority to add within that initiatives around additional learning needs, looked after children, other programs that the authority are putting in. So we can all look at what our contributions have been, but ultimately that will allow you to hold us accountable by individual school, for us to do it by challenge advisor, and for you as an authority to say, these are all these schools, this is where they were last year, this is where I am now, this is where the money's been invested, has it made a difference? But we're not there yet. And that money they'll be part of the core provision, but a great deal of the intervention work will be around their investment of their school effectiveness grant, our investment of the retained grant. One last thing on finance, Chair, is to say that the SEG grant is many millions of pounds, and when we inherited the 5 local authorities, the level of delegation to schools was only 72%. So a third of the money was being held back, either to appoint people centrally, to monitor budgets. We're now at 85% delegation, so a far higher proportion of that grant has actually gone to schools, which is where it should be. And we look to continue to drive that. I'll move on to the next question, Chair.
Thank you.
And that's to do with evidence that clearly shows satisfaction levels through self-assessment. Nicola's going to pick this up. I mentioned this with you last term, that we carried out an independent survey. I didn't want it done by our organisation. It's done individually online, non-attributable, so we don't know which school. We know how many schools, but we don't know which schools said what across the region. We've got our regional figure, but Nicola will take you through the figures for Monmouthshire.
Thank you. What I've prepared for you really are main headlines. There were 76 questions. I won't go into detail because we'll be here for the remainder of the morning, but just to give you a flavour of the kind of areas where perhaps you know that you've raised concerns, or areas that schools have responded back to as areas of strength and development. I'm going to start from how many of the schools. Well, 23 of the schools responded. As Steve said, it was an independent survey. We don't know which of your 23 schools responded because the anonymity of that is important in terms of making sure that they're giving us clear feedback. 91% of those who responded agreed that as a head teacher, they were fully aware of the strategic direction of school improvement in the region based on the information from the EAS and our partnership with the local authority. So that's a relatively strong agreement level. More mixed, at 65% of schools who responded agreed that they were clear around the relative roles and responsibilities of the EAS and the local authority. And Steve and I know that obviously out of this are actions for us, and we've been talking about preparing some very clear information for schools about what is our role and what do the EAS do, what's the local authority role, where those two are distinct, and where in the middle is actually where we work in partnership and where we work hand in hand, because from a school's perspective it's really important to get that right. So there's a fair differential between those two things. We talked quite a lot about consistency of systems leaders and challenge advisors and concerns for that. And given the fact that there have been for some schools a high turnover or change and consistency they were looking to bring about, there were still 81% of the schools who thought that the system leader knew their school well, and 87% who thought that the system leader challenged their schools to improve. So that was up until summer last year. And 82% agreed that the feedback from the system leader enabled the schools to understand what they need to do to improve. Now, obviously, one of my jobs, and I'm sure Steve will hold me to account for that, is to up that figure again this year, actually, that consistency is better and the response from schools is stronger, that they feel that their challenge advisor, as it will be, knows them better and gives them more formative feedback. And interestingly, and I wouldn't have thought it would be this high, but there you go, 87% agreed that the feedback from the system leader was provided in a timely manner and reflected the outcomes of the meeting, and that 91% agreed that the pupil and school performance targets agreed with the LA and the EAS provided schools with a challenge to improve. Now, I suppose that falls out of what Steve's talked to you today about that. Considerable and significant improvement at Key Stage 4 for schools in Monmouthshire. They did reflect it had provided them with a challenge and that they had improved. However, it's not all good news. All of these things have a balance, and in every survey, packaged into that are our areas for development. Around 60% of schools felt that the support for their SEG, PDG and WEG enabled them to complete those effectively, and we know that's one of the areas that we will work on developing, make sure schools are as clear as possible, working in partnership with the local authority in order to ensure that our systems and the local authorities come together and that schools feel clear about best use of that money. If you're not aware, and it's a funny old term, somebody was asking my SID what that was about, we developed for schools a school improvement dashboard, which is the SID acronym. Last year was a rollout and a pilot project, and 65% of the schools agreed that it had been effective in supporting their SEG, WEG and PDG planning. Plans are already in train to develop that further and look at how that plugs into school development planning, and that tool can be utilised more effectively. So at the end of the first year, we got a 65% agreement rate. And also we got a response back that there are some key areas of training that schools want us to give in more detail, and the two that stood out most to me were national curriculum subjects. You'll have heard Steve's talking about. We very much, in line with national priorities, a focus on literacy, numeracy, ICT. Schools are clearly giving us a message that around national curriculum subjects is an area of growth for us because they don't have access to that broader range. And tackling poverty and disadvantage are the strong focus from the government on eligibility for free school meals and underperformance. And the work that we're doing this year is a key part of categorisation. What are outcomes like for pupils who are eligible for free school meals? How effectively is the PDG plan spent, and how does it target improvement in there? I think probably from our training arm, that's giving us a message there's more work to do to support schools of how do you make the difference to pupils who are most vulnerable. And in order to keep it brief and light for you, the interesting one, because this links into another question that you asked around governing bodies. The response we got back from school was that 92% agreed that the governing body is able to access quality advice and support from the EAS when required. I know that's an area we've been looking at developing with Monmouthshire schools over the last year, and that at this moment in time seems a relatively strong feedback and one that we'll work to develop further. So without going into detail, those are broad headlines in terms of strong messages back about what we're doing reasonably well and some areas for us to develop in. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
I'll just add briefly to that, Chair. First of all, when I met with challenge advisors to discuss the fact that 80% of schools were satisfied with them, there were about 50 of them there, and there were 5 tables of 10, and it meant that one table of 10, the equivalent of, was not working. So we can get carried away here with the positives, and I'm not suggesting Nicola by any means it will not, but getting up to 90 is better. But there are a lot of messages in there for us, and what I've said to schools is there are 10 key messages that we pulled out across the region. Monmouthshire is not markedly different to the others. Is you said that, this is what we're doing, and in spring next year we're coming back and asking you exactly the same questions. So have we made that difference? One of the big ones is about the role of the local authority in the regions. I'm working with the directors on how we position that. Getting a chart, a sort of A3 chart for a head teacher's office and to share with governors and reinforcing that is going to be important. But we need to actually start to practice and embed that. And I think that as far as Monmouthshire is concerned, the fact that joint meetings, when conferences and discussions are held, the fact that our staff are there hearing the same message is important to us. But it is one of our tools, it's not the tool. The SEG, my SID, my School Improvement Dashboard, is part of the ICT development I mentioned earlier. And I'll leave it there for that survey, Chair. Lastly, the evidence to confirm that training to governors have been provided. I had to go back to the minutes to get the specifics here. The reality is, in terms of the attendance at governors, and Monmouthshire is the highest, 100% of schools in Monmouthshire have accessed training. The area that was being referred to here was the compulsory statutory training, and it was around data. And the challenge around the statutory training is if a governor who was appointed prior to September 2013, they have 1 year to get that statutory training under their belt. And if you don't have it, the expectation is the chair of governors will remove that governor from the governing body. There were, because of the provision, there were inevitably some people who did not access that. And the question has been asked since, what are you doing about it? Well, the first thing is now, for the past 2 years, when we brought the 5 local authorities together, we didn't have the common database of every governors for every school up to date. We now have that. We now are able to track those governors who have not attended training, and in communication with the school and the governing body to say, look, is this because of access? You couldn't make that one event, and how can we, this term, how can we fill those gaps so that we cover all those who genuinely want to do it? But those then who don't do it, then we'd be advocating to the chair of governors that they take that action, particularly if it reflects a general lack of commitment from that governor to work within the school. With secondary schools across Monmouthshire and across the regions this year, again, because the stakes in terms of the level of performance across the region of secondary schools is lower than primary schools in relative terms, we will be targeting every governing body as a full governing body for secondary schools to do the training as a full unit with the data, the examination data, in context. So they'll have the statutory materials, but they'll have their own governing materials. One last thing on governors is the other thing that we've committed to, this came up last weekend, is that for all red and orange schools, we will visit the governing body this term, maybe some of them slightly into the oranges, slightly into the spring term, to take the governing body through the categorisation, because you should have no surprises when you see the publication of the data and understand what's underneath it. And most importantly, listen to the head teacher, chair of governors, the challenge advisor to say, we are confident that the actions are going to taking place is going to move this school over a period of time out of this category and into another. I'll finish there, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr Davis and Nicola. Have anybody got any questions? It was very informative. It does show that there is progression, but I'm still sure that there are some outstanding questions. Councillor Parley.
Thank you. I'm not sure whether this is one for Steve or Nicola. I mean, I'm glad that you've been appointed, and I'm sure that you're already making a difference. I just need, I think, a bit of reassurance about how your role is actually delivered. Is it fair to say it's primarily managerial, or are you going to be maintaining, as it were, a presence in schools in your own right, as opposed to going in helping somebody else?
Thank you, Councillor Farley. That's a good question. My role at the moment also incorporates to be challenge advisor for 7 of the schools across the local authority. I need to remain in touch with the job and actually what it looks like and how we undertake the visits, and to make sure that we understand, because that will help me moderate. So I've got 7 of the schools across the region. But you're right, a key part of my role is to support and quality assure and challenge the other challenge advisors to make sure that the decisions that they make and how they build the bespoke support around a school is effective, and keenly to work in partnership with your local authority, the people sitting at this table and the wider group, and to coordinate the meetings with them so that we do things in a very joined up manner, subtly differently. Does that answer your question?
It does indeed, thank you.
Councillor Powell.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a small one in reply to your worry about governors taking up all the training that they should have. I think some of the difficulties, in particular where the governors that are parent governors and of course have got children to see to, is the distances. Of late, there have been governor training in long areas apart, and their difficulty in getting to them. And I wonder if anything could be done in a way that could bring those trainings rather into a cluster of schools rather than at long distances.
I'll start this one, and then Nicola will come in, because she's been doing some local work within Monmouthshire. The ones that I've talked to, those who've seen these others at a distance, some in Llanwern and Newport. The reason we put those on at other times is that sometimes, for the reason they can't get to the local one, or the one that's most local, so we don't look to force them out of the region, but some do use it, because also we also change the time of the day, because some people are happy to do it in the morning or afternoon. We have been looking at local delivery. We can't get to a position where we offer across the region that, but we have been looking at it, and Nicola will pick up this on some of the local discussion.
What we've tried to do, Councillor Powell, is, and if we look at the organisation for this year, is that we'll run training for governors out of this building in Usk. Monmouthshire is a large and varied county with huge distances, and Usk, we believe, is a good training venue and reasonably central for most people and realistic for them to get to. So the training that's planned, and it's actually me and Senior Challenge Advisor Chris Cherry, who is kind of my partner in crime in Monmouthshire, if you will, who are undertaking all of those trainings through the year. Data is being delivered by Ed Price, also out of Usk. So there is an option, a realistic option for Monmouthshire governing bodies. In addition to that, challenge advisors will do, and I know I've done it in the past and I'll encourage them to do, go out and work individually with governing bodies. So you might go through an individual governing body's data pack. You might do some work as a cluster with them, but the core and statutory element of the training, if we run from Usk for now, it's a reasonable distance, and we've tried to be responsive. You're right, some of them in the past have travelled over to Tredommen or somewhere. It's quite, I know from experience, it's a long way out there, and to bring it into Usk appears to be working. I ran one last week, we've got one at the end of this next month, and rolling into next year. That is the plan.
Councillor Jones.
Thank you.
We couldn't do it for accountability, but if the governing bodies of those schools wanted to do some joined-up work, we shouldn't stop them doing that. And the fact that we are supporting a school in Monmouthshire, if it happens to be engaged with another school, we wouldn't draw boundaries. Draw the line at Carlisle or something like that. But
but is there any sort of similarity between the old system and the new system?
There are major differences. There are some similarities. There are major differences in the accountability regime, the inspection regime. There is no real middle tier there is a middle tier which can be academy chains that manage groups of schools. The system that we're using here around the 3 stages of categorization is quite unique. It does use the data, it does build in that professional, and it's now something closer between what used to be banding or just a set of data and an inspection. there should be a far greater correlation, and the new inspection regime may well take note of those schools who are spending too long in the reds and the orange because they've been in the post main, and they may want to visit those more to encourage progress that we would want anyway.
Councillor, sorry. All right, Councillor Powell, followed by Mr. Plough.
How do you ensure the quality of teaching? Obviously, you've got control over the teachers that are employed through the system, but the teachers that come into schools, specialised teachers, possibly those with teaching those with learning difficulties or speech therapy or all those other outside things that have to be brought into school. How do you ensure the quality of that teaching?
I'll start and others will come in. That ultimately, that is the quality of teaching in a school is the school's responsibility. Where there are the core area of ongoing day-to-day teaching and learning in schools, we've put a lot of support in through an Excellence in Teaching framework, and part of the moderation process tests the school systems for its own quality assurance, not only of its own teachers, but of its teaching assistants and others who would come into the school. So in making a judgment of whether a school would be green, yellow, orange or red, there are key questions, and it actually goes further than that, and we picked this up again at the Governors' Conference, because while we need to be confident that there are systems in place, governors have a key responsibility in knowing, and you cannot be a green school unless not only is the head teacher having the quality assurance systems in place for teaching teachers within the schools and outside it, there has to be evidence that the governing body are aware of that, and just as importantly, are aware of what's being done as a result of that. Because if it is inconsistent, you want to see what actions are taking place. I'll stop there, because the staff will come from a range of resources. Do you want to add anything on?
Just briefly, where you get specialist teachers or other people coming into school, Councillor Powell, it would be part of the remit of the school to check on the quality of the work that's going on, or where children are in the intervention groups or support, to monitor their progress. And our role, if you like, is to support the school to make sure it gathers good first-hand evidence of what impact that's had on pupil outcomes. And actually, some of those are quite expensive models to have tiny groups. Do they deliver the impact in terms of outcomes, or are there better ways of redesignating, redesigning and making that education as powerful as it can be for the young people? So we have a role in supporting, but not directly observing that.
Mr. Plough, can I bring in people who want to come back on this subject first? Is that all right? Sharon, would you like to speak, please?
In response to the particular groups that you've identified, Councillor Powell, the local authority provide SPLD service, for example, and some ALN support. And with regard to that, we are responsible for monitoring the quality. For teachers, performance management processes are in place. And quite rightly, as Nicola said, we constantly are evaluating the impact of that support in schools. Part of the review of the SPLD service last year was to continue support, but to increase the capacity of schools in order to deliver that, to make a more effective model going forward for our schools in the future. So whilst we work very closely with the EAS, responsibility would lie within the local authority with regard to that particular area.
Sorry, Mr. Plough.
Okay. I think with regard to governors, one of the areas of weakness is that people are nominated or coerced into being governors without really having any background knowledge of their responsibilities. That's an area I don't know. We need a communication process that really makes them far more aware of what their responsibilities will be when they take on that responsibility. And the other point I wanted to make is do you really seriously consider the feedback you get from training sessions? Because I know lots of governors who've fed back lots of quite positive ideas, but they never be considered, like sort of, I don't know, timing of meetings, because we've got an overponderance of elderly governors and governors perhaps who don't work, whereas you've got a lot of potential governors out there who do work, who have a very good business acumen that could be terribly important nowadays to helping to govern a school. So are these things that you are currently considering and looking at?
I'll take them in order that you shared, because I was really encouraged by Saturday's event, not because everyone said it was great, but actually there was a sense of energy there amongst people of all ages. And what it focused in my mind is, I think we may need to get out more. I say this to head teachers, we need to get out more and run some public events on a Saturday, or to actually say to people who are interested in becoming a governor, maybe promote that through some of the business, talk about the positives, because there are a lot of positives. So those people, first of all, it supports recruitment, but if people are considering, even for the ones where we might be doing promotion events, but there may be others through your own governor groups where people are thinking about it. So on a termly basis, we provide an event which says, doesn't frighten them to death, but it actually says, this is the challenge, but this is a real exciting opportunity. So I will be pursuing that with Liz Everson, who's the head of governor support. Do I believe all of the reports? No, that's why I tried to get as many as possible anonymous, because as soon as people, when you're there and they're writing about you, you almost think of that, do you see them putting your form across, they recognise your writing, or particularly if they've asked you to put your name on it. The idea of, we want to hear advice on the changes. People said to us, change the time of the event and vary it across regions. We've done that. But do we always capture that? I'm not confident we do, and it's always the pursuit of it. We will do some cluster where we can. We will do it. The danger comes when one governing body says they've done it for us, everybody else will want it. We'd aim to do that, but there'll always be a pragmatic element to it. The reality is, again, I'll go back to the budget. When we set up the EAS, there were 5 very different models, and people were comfortable with what they have, but in cost effectiveness, it just wasn't working, and there was a heavy subsidy. And the first thing we did was reduce the budget by 10%, but we want to, not all is tied to the budget. I generally think there's better access now than there was 2 years ago for some authorities, but there are in some areas, the quality of service as perceived by the people, which are important, still hasn't got back to that level, but we'll be pursuing it. But we are going to push on, so look out for those launch events to encourage more to come.
I pick up one. Just picking up one small point around what you said about people really understanding their responsibilities as a governor. You're quite right, it's a weighty responsibility. And one of the things we've looked at in the service is we do governor induction training, and what we've realised is we almost need 2 pathways into that. There are those who are familiar with schools and settings and perhaps might be a teacher and become a governor, and their need for training at induction might be at a higher level than those who perhaps have never worked in the education system and the last time they went to school was 50 years ago themselves. So we're trying to create 2 pathways for those who've got knowledge of the jargon and the systems, so that their induction is subtly different from those who are not. So we're trying to listen, but Steve's right, we haven't got it perfect yet. Okay, thank you.
Councillor Webb.
Thank you very much. Welcome, Nicola. Thank you very much. Very interesting. Steve, you've clearly refined the process of target setting. And I'm just wondering if Nicola could ask when you expect us to see the results of this. Obviously not in this school academic year, but I'm just wondering when you foresee. Don't be realistic.
Thank you, Councillor Webb. It's a very structured process that we're going through at the moment, and we've fundamentally changed some key pieces of work around our target setting. For example, we did originally set a range for our targets, and we've moved to a single target this year to bring us in line with the rest of Wales and for lots of other functions. Our deadline within the EAS is by the 17th of October. We'll have initial targets of schools with a series of dates then going through October and into early November, where we'll quality assure those. So they'll go to challenge advisors, they'll come to me, we'll look at whether or not we think there's sufficient rigour and challenge in those targets. And by the time we get to the 24th of November, we'll have a very finished and defined job to bring back to the local authority so that they can undertake their role to look at further challenge. We've already discussed this at some length. We'll be working in partnership during that period of time to make sure we've got all the relevant information and that aspiration is high enough for the young people in Monmouthshire. Then during the year, as Steve alluded to, what will roll out are a series of returns, for a want of a better word, where schools will come back formally and say, yep, all of our pupils are on target just in the way that we anticipated that they would be, or, oh, no, they're not, because that's our opportunity to respond and to look at the needs of a school. So in theory, we'll have a defined set of targets that the local authority and ourselves are happy with, schools are clear about, and that will be able for you to set a trajectory of what next year and the year after and the year after that will begin to look like. Does that answer your question? Thank you.
Anybody else? Thank you, Nicola. That was very informative. Anybody else got any questions? Yes? Sorry, Councillor Clark, did you have... Oh, sorry. Okay.
What do you consider to be your core business, and how are you funding the additional services you provide, for example, questionnaires for schools at no cost?
Our core business is teaching, learning and leadership in a nutshell. And our core business really is about leadership of teaching and learning. And all that we do focuses on that. Clearly, some of the outcomes that are used, the raw outcomes, give an indication of the impact on that. They're more rounded measures that we look for, and then are always come to the forefront. And Nicola touched on the breadth of the curriculum and national curriculum. And what I'm really encouraged about the judgments that we're making about schools is, yes, it starts with standards, but if you look through the criteria which judges a school to be green or red, they are almost entirely about leadership of teaching and learning, leadership by the governors, leadership by the head teachers. Ultimately, they are the deliverers of improvement. We can influence them and we can help support and remove barriers and we can enable. But the day job and at the heart of our work is about how we influence positively, say sometimes removing the barriers, but how do we influence that? Now we influence it through leaders. We've talked a good deal about governors, through head teachers, leadership programs, middle leaders, people who are heads of department or leaders of literacy in terms of their leadership skills as well as their understanding of teaching and learning. I personally have been on every secondary school in the region and asked them 3 questions around their leadership of teaching and learning. What systems do they have in place to enable it to happen? Are the accountabilities clear? Do every person who's got an additional responsibility know what it is about that job that provides an entitlement for other teachers to get better at teaching and learning? And that's at the heart of it. And the third element, I say, well, what culture are you setting? Because you could have an establishment that is very top-down, lots of monitoring, lots of inspection, but doesn't develop learning amongst the teachers. And we have to model that for ourselves in terms of our own service. In terms of additionality, some things that we do, we charge for. It's a cost. Those relate to the resources that schools have available through their grants to spend on, but they can spend that anywhere. If that's going to be put forward as an offer, then we take it past groups of head teachers to say, is this something that you believe? I have what I think I mentioned last time, it's a bit like a dragon's den. My team bring in what they believe schools would want to purchase and use. I have groups of primary and secondary head teachers who say, yes, that's good, or that needs to be tweaked, or no, we don't think that it should be there. When it comes to surveys, we guide them towards, there are free surveys now, SurveyMonkey and things that they can do themselves, which online don't require significant investment. We also, though, broker other organisations, private sector, third sector, who want to come in and have something to offer. We look to accredit that offer and encourage it. But now we really are at the pinnacle of school to school, because as we move into the next cycle, as we move into the next spring, it'll be the schools who will be coming forward and saying, actually, I think I've got a better offer than you are offering, EAS, and I'll offer it at this cost, and you facilitate it. Well, that's great for me, because the resource is out there to use. I can choose to use my resource differently. And ultimately, as I said, the EAS has become a smaller organisation that is cheaper for councils, and that should continue.
Thank you.
Not always popular amongst my colleagues.
Okay. You explained earlier in your formal questions and answers about the underspend in the previous year on our budget of 69k, and obviously by setting the same budget again this year there's another 69 in theory, so there's 138,000. Can you explain the impact of the 138k on support of the schools in this year, please?
We haven't set the same budget. We've set a new budget that had that money is committed. So it wasn't exactly the same budget. The budget was reallocated specifically around school to school work. Yeah. The 600,000 underspend was allocated with the agreement of the board into key activities around literacy, numeracy, leadership, teaching and learning. We don't anticipate having that underspend again this year, and our own monitoring, in the same way schools monitor targets, that we're spending it. At the same time, we will not spend it for spending's sake. If we believe that we've made that difference, we've set that budget, and mid-year we find that it's either not working, we wouldn't just slavishly keep pushing that money in that direction. Ultimately, it goes back to schools, it goes back to local authorities, and it can't help with the challenges of budget cuts.
Yes, Reverend James.
Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Plough.
I'd like just to pursue a little bit about the categorisation, if I may. I think possibly to actually clarify in my own mind rather than anything else. But if I'm right, the schools are going to be categorised using various criteria, some of which will be assessed via the schools and the EAS and the local authority, some of which will be categorised by the Welsh Government. And presumably schools will then get a matrix which tells them what category they're in for each of those criteria. How is the overall criteria for a school then assessed? I mean, does the Welsh Government have the dominating view? Do the local authority or the EAS have the predominant view? Who actually assesses which overall category the school goes into?
Ultimately, it's the local authority who makes the judgment, but it will want evidence and it will want confidence of moderation systems. Fundamentally, you can't change the first stage. That's the government, and they won't change it. Yeah. The second stage is there are a clear set of criteria, and we look for best fit. It's not a tick box which says they do all these 10 things. They bring evidence to it. That's the second stage. They've got it now in schools, and the heads are already making judgments and bringing an evidence base as to where. So when the challenge advisor visits, they're going to be well prepared, most of them. And it is the power of that discussion, really, that then does two things. One enables the agreement of where they are, or where they believe they are, challenge advisor and school. We're already thinking about then what the improvement strategy is going to be. But when you've got to that stage, which we anticipate probably by the end of November, we will then come back to schools, to local authorities in December, who want to know, what's your evidence base for this? It'll be in the reports that will have come, but the chance then to come back and challenge us to say, could you look at this again? Or I don't agree with this. And then we will come to a final judgment, which will then have the school will need to be informed. But ultimately, Welsh Government have to accept that judgment. What we are doing with Welsh Government at the moment, because this is a partnership between the regions and Welsh Government, is we're agreeing a moderation process where other regions come in to look at some of our work. We go to other regions. There is somebody from Estyn, somebody from Welsh Government, and 4 people, one from each of the regions. It's my Assistant Director, Debbie Hartsfeld, from our region, who are agreeing all those processes, and then we will be operating them to give Welsh Government confidence that stage 2 and 3 2 being the challenge advisor working with the head, and 3, the local authority to final judgment, that the rigour is and the consistency is brought into that. But ultimately, it's the local authority who make the judgment, and we provide their information then for the 5 councils through to Welsh Government, and it will then be published.
And so presumably the Welsh Government, as long as they feel that you've got the supporting evidence to match your judgment, they will accept it. And if not, they'll come back and challenge you, presumably, before making a final decision.
They're really looking at the monitoring and moderation. There won't be, I don't think, be much resource coming out from Welsh Government at the interface between the school and the challenge advisor, or the challenge advisor and the authority. What they're looking for is confidence in the rigour of the monitoring system.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we could start to wind this up, but I think, Mr. Plough, do you want to ask a question?
Just one, please, Chair, although it's in 3 parts. How do you ensure the accuracy of teachers' assessment, particularly what measures are in place to ensure there's a consistency across Monmouthshire and the consortia? And how do you ensure that teachers' assessment correlate with the national assessments?
This is one of the most fundamental weaknesses in our system today, teacher assessment. And it's a challenge because in the primary phase, it's on which we focus a lot of the judgment on the performance, that first step, which is why the moderation at stage 2 is important. There are some authorities who are at the top of the league of 22 local authorities on teacher assessment, and a third off the bottom when it comes to tests. So we have been living, and I think this is a responsibility of Welsh Government, the regions, local authorities, schools, that the system has allowed us to inflate for understandable reasons. We've put pressure on targets. Esting come in and say, well, the primary results we have, this is the secondary results. I've had discussions with very senior officers and councils who are saying, I want my key stage 3 results up next year by 4%. It's pretty easy, you just go down and tell the heads. It doesn't work like that. So our confidence in that is at a critical stage. And I personally have had discussions with Welsh Government as we move into a new programme of study in 2015 as to whether we need a moratorium, where we say, can we all stop and get real? That said, we have last year strengthened the moderation process and the commitment of schools to it. So there's a structure where historically clusters have got together to bring their exemplification of materials. But before you even get that, you've got to make sure there's standardization in the school, particularly where there's more than one class. So getting the standardization right and the moderation. And we've done a lot of work to do that. And we're going beyond the clusters, because if Nicola's a colleague head of mine and a teacher in my cluster, and I show her my work and say, I think that's a fantastic level X, and she looks at it and thinks, is she going to upset me? Is she going to challenge me? Maybe. Well, Nicola would. But in that situation, you're more open to, and some schools have not been taking it seriously. There are legal requirements to participate, and the tightness of it, and the difference sometimes between primary schools who brought fantastic materials and secondary schools who've not treated it with. They've sent a junior member of staff and not the senior member of staff to deal with it. This year, with Welsh Government, we'll be strengthening the moderation requirements about schools' evidence of engaging with standardisation and moderation, and a lot more activities. We've got to balance this. We're not taking people out of schools too much. But there will be a moderation. There will be Welsh Government are investing in a contract for some, not heavy, but some external moderation. So the categorisation method I mentioned earlier, schools will have to demonstrate to give what they're doing to give the challenge advisor confidence to put them at those higher levels. But ultimately, it's unfair if we just said to teachers, if we put all those things in and drove the schools to put the standards down because it's their fault, when all of us from Welsh Government to individual teachers are responsible for where we're at. I think we just need to move past that, offer that year of amnesty where we get honest, and it will result in, and members will have to accept it, it will result potentially in schools, groups of schools and local authorities, teacher assessments coming down during that year. But the important thing about all that moderation is what the teacher does next. And if the secondary teacher or a year 5 a primary teacher is taking on assessment materials or test results, teacher assessment results, for pupils, it needs to be on a strong foundation. And if we built it on a foundation that is not strong, for reasons of external pressure, then we need to get real. And I believe generally the year of 2015 to 16 will be what I call the get real year, and we'll all be honest.
If I can pick up an additional point to that, one of the things that I think will be key in our working relationship, and I know I've spoken to officers sitting at the table here, is around ensuring that we give a very joined up message to heads around moderation and assessment. One of the things that Steve alluded to is perhaps in the past head teachers weren't overly interested always in engaging with that moderation process, and we had a fair number of heads who attended, but not all, and I know I've got the support of the local authority in ensuring next year that everybody's engaged in that process. Looking across Monmouthshire, Steve's quite right, we're looking at that correlation where there's a match between teacher assessment and test outcomes, though it can be comparing strawberries and donkeys, they're not always necessarily the same thing. And generally, largely speaking for Monmouthshire, there is a positive correlation, but more interesting where there isn't, about how we support a school to understand and make more robust judgments.
Briefly to add, Monmouthshire had already come to us through Councillor Hackett-Payne and directed to challenge us, to say, please work with us on this. Not we don't trust our schools, but please can we work and get the honesty behind this. And it's one of 2 authorities to date across the region, so it makes my pleas to Welsh Government easier when and my discussion, I've shared this with heads through seminars in the primary heads and secondary heads, and they are very keen for it to happen so they can get honest with it, really.
Sarah, sorry.
Can I just say how clear and honest that was? And I know a lot of my fellow governors will be quite pleased when I report that back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Plough. Sarah, would you like to add to that?
Thank you, Chair. Just to add one thing, really, Mr. Plough and other members here. Steve's already mentioned that Cabinet Member and I have contacted the EAS and asked them as our Commission service to carry out work with us that will involve looking very closely at particularly our Year 6 and Year 9 outcomes and tracking those outcomes to be clearer around the quality of teacher assessments in our schools. As Steve's quite rightly said, this isn't about not trusting our schools. This is about making the job, supporting the job, because from the teacher's perspective, particularly in a country where we don't anymore have external validation at Key Stage 2 for teacher assessment, that job is a huge responsibility, as is the job of governance, as you've already mentioned. So this is about supporting our practitioners to be better at what they do. That is intrinsically linked with the quality of teaching in classrooms. Where teacher assessment is more accurate, the quality of teaching tends to be much better. So that's to give comfort to us all that we're working hand in hand on that. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that about sums it up. You'll be... Oh, sorry, Councillor Webb.
Just, Chairman, thank you for allowing me. I'm sure, Steve, you've had enough. This is worse than a parliamentary select committee, I think. Can I just raise one point? You know that you mentioned the 69, mention was made of the 69k. If it's not spent, will it be spent somewhere else? I hate to say, or will it? Where will it? What will happen to it?
It'll have to be transparent, and your members will be on the board that will help make the decision. There are three areas where we are monitored. One is by our director, the other is by Councillor Hackett-Payne through School Effectiveness Group and the others through Councillor Greenwood. So we have to get all those budgets and spends through those. My anticipation is that it's not about it not being spent. It's about how much of that will contribute to the cuts that we have to offer in year. This is not about next year. We have to find £800,000 now, before April, out of this year's budget. So if you take the 600,000, well, we've spent a fair amount of that this year on things we've already done. So what we're looking at with the council, so it will go. Last year was the first full year of a budget where you brought 5 councils together. If you looked at the millions of pounds involved in that, in terms of the retained seg amounts, the traded income, the core budget, and it shouldn't have been as high as £600,000. But you know, there is this year we'll have more confidence, more systems in place, and more vigilance around the process to make sure that it's spent. But I'll go back to what I said earlier. I don't want to spend it for the sake of spending it. If I find there are ways in which we can use it more creatively with schools to schoolwork, or we're facing the challenge with local authorities in terms of, I've offered up reductions over the period of time, and you know, I think it's getting on for about 20% less now than the core budget than Monmouthshire was spending 4 years ago on school improvement. But my response is be confident. It will be spent. There will not be an underspent, but it's about spending it in the right places, and that's where the board hold us to account and the directors hold us to account. The pain I've gone through this year for the underspend, I don't really want to be there again.
Halfway through the budget.
Yes, yeah. Yes, yeah. Thank you.
Right, is that the end of the questions? Thank you very much, Mr. Davis, and for Nicola as well, for attending today and for answering us in such a direct way. It was informative and reassuring to hear that Monmouthshire is the most improved authority, but the results are improving overall. But obviously, better accountability is a key issue which we must follow through. We need to know that Monmouthshire is getting value for money, and I think we do have a better understanding of how the MCC investment is being spent. So thank you for that. The next step, I think, will be the post-categorisation scrutiny alongside, obviously, follow-up and updates. But thank you both very much.
Thank you, Chair.
Right, to continue this subject, we're now going to ask questions of, in order, the Cabinet Member, see Liz Hackett-Payne, and then the officers. I think, Sarah, you're going to answer those, and Leader Councillor Peter Fox as an ex-member of the board. So can we start the questions, please, for Councillor Payne? Councillor Powell.
Thank you. Good morning, Liz. How many Monmouthshire schools currently have intervention plans?
There are currently 6.
Thank you very much. Is that a similar, is that more or less than has been?
Just to expand on that a little, there's a very much ongoing process looking at intervention plans. Schools come in and out of having those intervention plans because, in effect, we look at all the schools in the county and see what intervention needs to go into all of the schools. And when a significant amount of intervention needs to be applied to that school, an intervention plan is produced, and then the school, the head teacher and the chair of governors are invited to come in and to be accountable for their actions and explain what they're doing about the process, how it's going forward, and what a difference that is making. The schools are then called back in the following term and again reassessed to make sure that what they've said is actually happening. You can imagine some schools make significant progress, and in effect that intervention is in effect not as serious as it was at the beginning, whereas others don't make quite the progress that is needed, and warning notices are needed.
Liz. Right. Anybody else got a question? Can I just follow that up then, please? How do we know if they're making progress against these plans? Are you? What if you're not satisfied? I mean, I know you have the meetings, but underneath they can say one thing, and underneath it can be something else.
We asked them to bring evidence to show us what, and obviously every school is different, but if it's, say, to do with performance, we would ask them to show evidence of that. We're also then involved with the EAS to see how that is working. And obviously Sharon, who looks at all the data within the school, would have other meetings with the schools. I have a one-to-one with Sharon on a monthly basis and a one-to-one with Sarah on a fortnightly basis, and on both agendas are schools causing concerns. So those questions would come up. That challenge would be there to Sarah and to Sharon to find out exactly what is happening. And then if the schools come in and we feel that they are not making progress and that has continued, a warning would be warning letter would go from the chief officer, and they would then, perhaps come in on not a termly basis, but perhaps on a more frequent basis.
Sharon?
Just to add to that, thank you, Chair.
Yeah.
When I report to Liz to Councillor Hackett-Payne in my one-to-one meetings, we look at the schools that are causing concern, and they are raised and discussed at that point, as they are then picked up with the EAS, and I consider the evidence from system leaders, challenge advisors, they need to move into the new terminology, challenge advisors, and I discuss that with the principal challenge advisor. We look at the progress the school has made, the impact of any interventions that have been ongoing, and that is sort of summarised and reported back to Cabinet member in order for her to monitor the progress in a much shorter timescale. We have intervention meetings and intervention plan meetings every half term. We wouldn't ordinarily bring every school in for scrutiny at every half term, but certainly at least every term. It will depend the reason for the school being identified as causing concern. For example, we have some schools at the moment who have been judged to be in significant improvement with Estin, and we review them on a half-termly basis in order to ensure that the EAS is supporting effectively, that the local authority are working effectively, and that the schools will indeed come out of significant improvement within the shortest period. And recently we've had schools that have been in Estin monitoring. We've a 100% success rate at the moment of coming out of that. That sort of Estin monitoring category. Derry Views has come out, the Dell and Osbaston very recently. We have another school that will be revisited at the end of December. And Castle Park have been working with us on a 2-year intervention plan in the summer. We're removed from that monitoring process as well. So, it is an effective way of working together, and information is shared at a regular period.
Sharon, anybody else? Yes?
Yeah, I was going to ask Liz about her personal involvement. Basically, you covered that in your previous response. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you. Any other questions? Councillor Jones.
I think the answer is yes, and the impact has been because the target setting from the EAS, like they were saying, is quite structured. It's quite easy in many respects to be able to see that the progress, the impact that has been made, a lot better than we've had before. So that impact can be seen. And for the intervention plans, there are various expected impacts written into that plan. So we would expect them to do A, B and C. So yes, you can see whether or not they've done that.
Oh, sorry, are those all the questions? Thank you, Liz.
for answering that. We'll now go ask questions of Chief Officer Sarah McGuinness, please. Sarah, are you all right to ask? Anybody got any questions for Sarah? Yes, Mr. Plough.
Hi, Sarah. Can you explain how you ensure that the EAS is challenged on their service delivery and how you ensure the EAS is held accountable for its performance?
Certainly. First thing to say is that the processes by which we do this have vastly improved over the last number of months. We have now very robust quality assurance processes. You might remember back around 15 months ago, we introduced a quality assurance process to know exactly that we were getting value from our commission service. Those processes have been further improved, I have to say. And since the beginning of this academic year, we're already on a very clear timeline of meetings and of challenge meetings with the EAS, the first of which took place, I think it was the 1st of September, I could be wrong, it might have been the 4th. In those meetings, we actually look very closely at the following issues. These are the broad headlines: personnel, school categorisation, school inspections, revisits, the accuracy of reports, etc. We meet around inclusion, ALN. We challenge the AAS in terms of pace of change in our schools. We look very closely at the impact of interventions and support and training. We also explore in all of those meetings wider stakeholder views, but ultimately we're looking at the value for money that we get from our commission service. You'll know that results are improving, so that actually is a clear indicator that where there is value for money, but that isn't necessarily the only indicator, of course. So broadly, they are the issues that we cover when we meet, and we meet very regularly. Outside those meetings, there are also continued intelligence meetings where we scrutinise the outcomes of individual schools. That's alongside the stakeholder meetings that we have, cabinet member, chief officer and other officers with our schools, which has already been mentioned. It's really important, I think, to make clear that we've been on a very interesting journey with the EAS over the last 15-16 months, where there have been some very difficult conversations, and with Steve here, I'm sure he would concur with that. But we are now in a position where I feel far more confident that we are getting a service that we deserve, that we pay for, and that's also quite clear in the quality of reporting that's now coming through from the EAS. And this is in very recent weeks. By far, the quality of a report that I've very recently received, in fact, I think it was the beginning of this week, it doesn't compare with the quality of some of the reports that I've had in the last 15 months. So we're on an upward trajectory in that relationship for sure.
Good, that's excellent news, because I think that was one of the Select's main concerns, was the quality of reporting. Anybody else got a question, please? Councillor Farley.
Thank you, Chair. I may have got my figures a little bit wrong here, but going right back to the early or middle part of Steve's presentation, he was talking about the anonymous returns that schools made, which are essentially, I guess, their assessment of the EAS. And somewhere shy of 20%, as I recall, were actually not necessarily satisfied. And I may have got the figure wrong, but nevertheless, somewhere in there is a gap. And I just wondered if you have any concerns about that, whether it's something that we would expect, that an advisory service doesn't please everybody all the time, or whether it might disguise something else, a dissatisfaction with the service itself, as far as the schools are concerned.
I think you've almost begun to answer the question, and you certainly touched on some of the things that, in my opinion, would be reasons for the figures that we get in these returns. First of all, not 100% of our schools didn't make the returns, and I believe that would be the case across the consortia as well. So, secondly, in terms of satisfaction rates, I think that when a school, and certainly a head teacher and governing body, are challenged in a way that they may not have been familiar with, that doesn't always translate in a positive reaction. I think that's probably the best way I can put that. I don't know that for absolute fact, but having been a practitioner and a head, I know that the challenge doesn't always result in, oh gosh, yes, please come in and challenge me a bit more. So that could be certainly a reason for that. I do think that we need to work harder, as has already been mentioned by Nicola, I think it was, in terms of schools and heads and governing bodies understanding the nature of the relationship with the EAS and the authority and between the EAS and the authority. And we're working now with Steve as a group of directors to develop a very straightforward flow chart, would be probably the best way of describing it, so that in all our schools across South East Wales, it is quite clear to anybody what the responsibilities are of the EAS, of the local authority, and where those responsibilities meet in the middle. And I would suspect that some of the reason for the satisfaction rates that Steve has mentioned and that Nicola have mentioned could be to do with a lack of clarity around the responsibilities of those two bodies.
And can I just come back on that? And if a school is being seriously challenged, and with good reason, is there also an element of denial, shall we say? Not me, Gov. We're actually doing all right. It's the system that's got us wrong.
It would be fair to say yes. That certainly has been circumstances that we've come across as an authority and as the EAS. But under no circumstances do we then shut the door on that. That conversation continues. And please, bear in mind that as an authority, we have taken full advantage of the power of a local authority to ensure that schools, their governing bodies and their head teachers are doing the right thing by the children in those schools. We have acted and we have intervened, and we would continue to do so if we felt it was necessary. It's only the local authority that can do that, not a commission service.
Thank you. Again, quite reassuring, I think. Anybody else? Councillor Jones.
The quality of challenge advisors is crucial to whether a school is successful or not. It's early days, but early indications do show us that improvements are absolutely clear. Obviously, that isn't embedded. We're in the first half term actually of a new academic year with new challenge advisors in some cases. But some of those difficult conversations that I mentioned earlier have been around ensuring that Monmouthshire has the best quality, absolute best quality when it comes to challenge advisors. I think it's quite clear that you will have seen yourselves this morning that there's been a shift in the quality of our principal challenge advisor. I absolutely welcome working in partnership with Nicola Allen, who has already made a big impact. And Nicola is on the ground. She isn't only working at a managerial level, she's operational, and she'll continue to do that, as will our local authority officers, because one of the things we haven't touched on this afternoon, is that local authority officers will actually are carrying out joint visits to our schools, because despite the fact that there has been an improvement in the quality of reporting, despite the fact that I am absolutely much more confident in the information and the data that's shared by the EAS with us and that's shared between us, I am also still absolutely clear that there is nothing better than local knowledge, and local knowledge means local authority knowledge. So we're working to ensure that our officers work hand in hand in terms of joint visits, as does the cabinet member in her her stakeholder meetings, etc. All of that information is absolutely intrinsically linked, but local knowledge is more important actually when it comes to that sort of challenge. It's not always about a challenge advisor, but yes, I am confident that the improvements in our challenge advisors are going to lead to improvements in our schools.
Thank you. Thank you. Councillor Powell.
Yes, you've expressed the good progress as is going along along this line, but do you still see some areas that could be improved?
I certainly do, and if other officers want to add to any of these areas, they're most welcome. But we've already mentioned this morning quality of teacher assessment. That is crucial, absolutely crucial to improvements in our education system, and not just in Monmouthshire, but across the rest of Wales. The contact that I've made on behalf of the Cabinet Member and myself with Steve, asking them as a commission service to work with us, looking really closely at the quality of teacher assessment, is not simply something that I see being a positive step for Monmouthshire. I very much hope that step is something that's going to impact on teaching, the quality of teaching across the country, because we do have to really make huge improvements in that nationally. There's still not a consistent approach to quality of teaching and learning, and that the steps that we want to make in terms of teacher assessment is intrinsically linked to that too, as is the training that's provided by regional consortia, leadership training, observation and monitoring training, ensuring that those in schools who are looking and who are observing teaching actually genuinely know what great looks like. Not what adequate teaching looks like, but what does great look like. So there are steps to be made there. We've already started to make steps in terms of target setting processes. Nicola mentioned that there is now one target and not a number. I have to say that Monmouthshire has been absolutely key to that change happening at a regional level. And again, difficult conversations, but worth it. And the other thing that does still need to be looked at is monitoring of grants and making sure that there are far improved procedures for scrutiny in terms of grant expenditure. But at a national level, I also have an opportunity with directors at national level to have an impact on that. And just last week, that issue was discussed. Monmouthshire is a county that believes in ensuring autonomy for schools where possible, and that schools should be managing their own money very, very well. It's about supporting that, not retaining money and acting like a nanny state. We are absolutely proactive in supporting our schools to be spending grants wisely, prudently, and seeing around corners.
Thank you. Anybody else? Councillor Clark.
Just categorically, are we getting value for money from the EAS? Categorically.
Categorically, now, yes.
But only now.
There have had to be some difficult conversations to get us to somewhere, but I think nothing can be born, nothing can start without a few hiccups, crawling. Let's proceed to walking. Now I think we're toddling. No, we're actually on a run. So I have to make those those analogies with a small one at home. But yes, I believe we are.
Some questions? Yes. Councillor Webb.
Thank you. Thank you, Leader, for coming this morning. You've been on the board of the EAS, haven't you, for some while, and you're stepping down for this position. Could you explain your role on this board, please?
Thank you, and thank you, members and chair, for inviting me today. It's good to come along and actually take part in such a really interesting select process, which has really held the EAS to account, and that bodes well. I suppose a little bit of history. I was probably quite fundamental to the evolution of the consortia, if you like, as a leader of Gwent, and some of you would have been part of large meetings in the old county hall where we brought all of the Gwent authorities together to try and get this forward, because there was an absolute moral business case for us to improve standards of education across Wales and certainly in South East Wales. So I was really pleased to be part of that, and I was pleased also then to be a leader sitting on the emerging company and then the board. I was the only leader on the board. There were other representatives at various levels from other participating authorities, and we've been on a journey, as very clearly we've seen today. And our role in the early days were obviously forming the company and its development and everything which went along with that, from staffing, recruitment to budget management, understanding all of those bits. But also trying to maintain a key improvement function for our authorities, whilst we were doing that. And, so my role was very much of a challenge in stewardship and helping, obviously, with my colleagues to make sure the company was evolving for the best interests of the wider region, recognising that as small individual authorities, it was probably going to be a struggle for us to provide these sorts of services alone. So there was a lot of work in those earlier days. In the recent days, obviously, the work has been around our budget management and challenge, in the same way as you do here and we do in the council throughout, looking at the various service models, the company development as it moves and picks up the various initiatives which we have to roll out, the monitoring of the SEG grant and the WEG grant and the pupil deprivation grant, and the allocation and monitoring and seeing how things are working along those lines. So very much a challenging role. We're there representing the area. I'm not just there to speak up. I'm not there to speak up for Monmouthshire. I'm there as a collective with colleagues where our interest as directors of that company are to make sure the company is efficient and running in line with all of its rules and regulations. And I think we've been on a learning journey as well, and it's evolving into something I'm feeling very much more proud of now. And it's been, I think Sarah picked it up well, that we've been on a journey, and now I'm feeling really, really confident of where we are. I've decided to step down from it. As I said, I was the only leader there, and I think it's so important now with the everything which is happening in local government at the moment and the changes, and also the moving forward of the new national model, which you'll see in your cabinet papers, is shares a detail of how that will be formed. But it was very important for me as a leader to step back, and I've done this in several areas around the council, so I can step back and take a key objective perspective on lots of areas, so I can hold lots of areas to account and make sure that this organisation is strong, resilient and sustainable. So that's one of the reasons why I've taken a step back. But it is important, as the new model is saying, that there is a senior members there, and I think the new model will strengthen the governance arrangements that are needed there. And we have to formally ratify Bob to take on that role, Councillor Greenland of that role at council on the 22nd. But people with that strong business acumen and things are going to be needed to make sure that's held to account strongly, and that will be replicated across the area. So I hope that gives you a flavour of where we are.
Thank you, Peter. Anybody else got any questions? Yes, certainly. Yeah. Councillor Farley.
Thank you. It's a very interesting model, Peter, that to have a board member of a company that's providing a service, and I can quite see why that is the case. And it's certainly a very useful opportunity to hear from you about your experience on the board. Looking then at, if you like, your legacy, what assurances can you give fellow councillors that the money that we allocate each year will deliver the maximum level of support for our schools and ultimately impact on the standards in our schools. I guess the shorthand for that is, how confident are you that in reality EAS is delivering a high quality service?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. I'm very reassured now, and I think we've heard a lot of evidence today to support that. In the earlier journey, which we talked about, we as board members were, probably with our individual counties hat on, were anxious that the service provided all it needed to do for its constituent councils, and it was fairly provided. We really the company has changed. It's matured. It's taken big steps. It's rationalised staffing and brought in some changes in that regard. And we have challenge advisors of an exceptional standard now. And they, as we know with Nicola here today, you will see that there's a far more focus on the individual authorities. And I am very confident that the model we've moved to, and we've got to now, is really going to be adding value. And I think if we play out with about 19% less we're investing now in improvement, that's what our contribution is, than when we were providing our own improvement service. However, the standards and in this last year have massively changed. You saw the improvement we've experienced in our schools, and that hasn't happened by chance. When we had Estin inspection, it was in its very, very early days. But this last 12 months or 15 months, there's been some huge change, and it's not just happened on its own from the board level. It's been a journey for everyone. So the challenge that's been provided by Sarah and Liz and the organisation here to the company through its challenge has really put them under pressure to make sure they are, we, the company, are being held to account. So I could reassure you, as leader now, I'm really confident, stepping away from it, that we have a strong, robust improvement service, which can and is delivering the challenge we want. We're having exceptional value for money as a county. Now I think reassurance could be taken from that. If you think of the 12.5% contribution we pay and what we're lifting out of that as a service, what we're taking from the service and what's being provided to us. I am very pleased. So I think you can be reassured, and I hope what you've heard today can give you further reassurance of that.
Thank you, and I mean, I'm personally reassured by that. My guess is that there is now, after a couple of years, a considerable amount of experience of working in this way, which ere long we might need to apply to other sectors and other enterprises. And I'm very reassured and encouraged. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Fox. Thank you for attending today, and thank you, Liz Hackett-Payne as Cabinet Member, and also Sarah as the officer. Thank you for answering those questions. I think before we have a short comfort break, poor Tracy, I know you're desperate to get on the next one, but we'll have a very short comfort break. But I would just like to say that I personally too am very reassured on behalf of the Select Committee. We've had some really positive messages today that there are improvements. That doesn't mean to say we must lessen our scrutiny, because it must be ongoing, but especially regarding the value for money, underspends, and post-categorisation, I think that's the next big issue. But on the whole, it has been extremely positive today, and I hope you all agree. I know we will discuss this more in future. All right, thank you. So if you'd all like to have a 2-minute break, 2 minutes, and then back, and we'll carry on with the other two items, which is, of course, the Children's Services update and finance. Thank you. Right, do you know, I think we'll start. Oh, I can't. Sorry. I've got no Sarah. Right, our next item on the agenda is Children's Services update, and Tracy is going to give us, talk us through this. And I just want to reiterate that this has been to Cabinet, and it is really quite late in coming to us. And what she is doing is giving us an update on the Children's Services. It's information only, although, of course, any questions arising, I'm sure she'll be happy to answer. Thank you, Tracy.
Thank you very much. Just today, there is a bit of an overview kind of on the front of this, but I just wanted to give you a bit of a presentation, really. Hopefully you've all got access to it, which is the pathway to change that we've been dealing with in Children's Services recently. Prior to me taking up permanent post with the authority in April, we had recognised there were some issues across the service, and we began working on those before I finally came into post. So just to, we've been working on basic things really around our purpose, and that is about enabling families and communities to keep children and young people safe and to reach their full potential, and that is something that we recognise as a priority really for the service. The background to the requirements that we have in our area is that we are child focused, that we have statutory obligations, that we're working to a prescribed framework, and this intervention, which is compulsory, it's not with choice with families, we have to intervene. And not only is there that compulsory intervention, there is state intervention around court frameworks that we work with. So the impact on children's services have been, what we've seen as we've been going through this change management process more recently is we've spent a lot of time on making things right instead of getting it right in the first place. And there's been quite a bit of duplication of those tasks because there may have been some information that wasn't key in the right area, so it's been done again rather than having it all in the right place at the right time, which has caused a lot of delay for staff and a lot of time wasted. We felt that we had quite bad publicity and PR with other agencies internally within Monmouthshire County Council and also with our court colleagues. We felt that we had a lack of capacity to develop and a lack of drive to achieve good practice, and a lack of consistent and known processes. There were a lot of frameworks and templates that were different in different parts and different versions. We didn't have a central point for them. And also staff morale had been very low for quite some time when I took over in April. We also looked at the children's experience. Normally with change management work, I usually start from the children's experience and work back because the staff situation was quite dire. We started from a staff perspective, but we also looked at what children's experiences were, and they were feeling abandoned when the cases transferred from one team to another. That there was a lack of accessibility and a continuity of social worker because we had quite a phase where there was quite a few social workers changing, and so children and young people were having to tell their stories a number of times and were not always heard and listened to properly. And sometimes they didn't understand why they were involved and the reasons for the decisions that were taken about them. And what we also found that parents had this experience too, and not just parents really, but any caregivers, grandparents, aunts and uncles. There had been some evidence of a loss of confidence in our service, not a huge amount, but there was some conflict with communication, some limited communication, and that was making it difficult with professional networks and working together. We also found that there was a lack of understanding about our service. There were quite a lot of calls coming into the local authority, into children's services, asking for something to be done. We can't do those things sometimes because there's a legal framework that doesn't allow those things to be done, but there was not that understanding across other agencies. There was an impact of constant change and developments within the multi-agency practice, which made those professional networks very difficult to develop. And the perception of the service from others within Monmouthshire County Council was quite difficult for children's services staff, and then they felt it was very negative. And there was a lack of shared priorities and focus across the service, really. So at the beginning of 2014, the staff described their barriers as the key performance indicators, the database system that we had, and a lack of tools to support them in their jobs. For example, we didn't have toys in the service, so they couldn't engage a child through play. There's quite a lot of change had been going on. We had a restructure last year, which they found very difficult. A lot of conversations in the council about children's service has been about overspend on budgets, and staffing had been quite variable over the period as well. But what the service were telling me they wanted was a focus on children and young people, that actually they wanted to be heard within the organisation, and that they were keen to improve services, and also to have appropriate resources to deliver those services, because they felt that there were quite significant gaps. So we've been working to solve quite a few areas around accommodation that meets our needs. We were in an establishment over in Chepstow that was very difficult for us to work from, was very unwelcoming. We've been working on a change in culture across the service over the past few months, and we've been working towards staffing being competent, confidence, and a change in attitude. It's quite a negative attitude from staff at some points. But we've been developing new ways of working. We've had sabbaticals where we took one team manager off frontline management for a period of 6 weeks and enabled that worker to actually look at all the policies and procedures that we had across the service and to make sure we had the right ones in place, updating the ones that we needed to. And we set up various other systems that this worker was involved in. We've worked at looking at how to reduce emails. We found a lot of staff were chained to their emails rather than seeing children and young people. And again, refocusing on what matters, which was the children. We've been working along with adult services on the IT system to develop a better system that works from a perspective of the practitioner, with the background KPIs and everything being taken off it instead of the system conforming to the KPIs. And we've also been looking at responses to external criticism. We've had a very challenging time in court the past few months, which has given us quite a difficult position. And staff were saying to me that the court is the problem, and actually some of the things that court were telling us, they were right. It's how they were telling us was the problem. So we've worked really hard with staff to kind of change how they think about challenge rather than it being a criticism. So we've worked over the past few months and have now relocated all our staff into Mega, and it's accessible to our service users and is accessible for staff and quite central in some respects. We're looking at contact venues that are family friendly. We spend quite a significant proportion of our funds on contact for families that we've had to spend on resources outside of the council, and we're looking at 3 venues across the local authority that will enable staff also to have agile working spaces as well as to have some really child-friendly locations. We've, as I said, been able to move together as a whole service, and I can't tell you the difference that has made to the service morale in a really short space of time, that they feel like they're a service now. They don't feel like they're 4 teams. They don't feel like they're kind of competing against each other so much, but they feel that they know who the rest of the service is, and they feel, and just links across with children and young people. We just walk across the hallway and check with, Deb Mountfield about things that are going on, and that's made a huge difference for staff. We've been more visible, I think, to the rest of the authority, building better bridges, working more with finance, those sorts of things. And we've worked towards staff and service users feeling valued and that their input is a requirement, and we're not just making decisions or setting up services and systems that don't have their input involved. We've obviously worked to make it safe for our staff, and they've been working and presenting themselves. We've talked a lot about how you present yourselves as a professional service and the differences that is for them as professionals. The culture change, we've had a clear focus on our purpose and doing what matters. And as I said, 1 service, not 4 teams. I've introduced what we call a catch-up session on a Monday morning, where I welcome people to the week, and I get varying responses if I'm honest. But we have had some really good input. I didn't make it mandatory, and I enabled staff to be able to come to that if they chose to, and now I have a nearly 100% attendance at that, pending any court cases and those sorts of things, and staff have really found that useful to keep involved in what's going on. We've looked at getting consistent policies. As I said, the member of staff that had a sabbatical has worked hard to get those policies and procedures. And we also have a children's services website that's only accessible to children's services staff, because we use that as good news stories about cases that have gone well, the information that's been circulated, good practice, changes in legislation, training and development sources. We also have things like legal planning through calendars on there, so we all know what should be in court and by what time and who's responsible for doing what. So we've got a consistent one point that I expect staff to look for information that's going on. And we've creating enabling, trusting and respectful culture within a framework of high expectations. I make it clear to staff that I expect the job to be done, but that I have a remit really to get rid of any barriers that are in the way of them doing their job. And if staff group who work with children and young people don't have toys, then that is something we will resolve. And although I've put on here one tea fund and stationery cupboard, it's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but I can't tell you how many hours of my life that took to get one tea fund and stationery cupboard, but I have achieved it. As I explained, we've got a new IT system being developed by staff also with adult services that will have make a huge difference to the service. We've also been experimenting with agile technology. We've been using Nexus 7 pads, which staff take out with them when they get documents signed by families. Instead of having it to bring it back, scan it in, take the form back out, they scan it there and then email the information that then goes onto our electronic system. So we're saving time, we're saving mileage, and we're making sure that staff are not spending time having to go out doing things that they shouldn't have to be doing again, and that the families have the information right from the outset. We've also looked at direct work applications that we've been putting on the pads, particularly for children who are non-verbal, so that they can engage with their social worker more effectively. I found when I took over my post within this authority that staff didn't feel that they were spending useful time, that the authority didn't think they were spending useful time if they were playing and engaging with children. I've worked really hard over the last few months to say that is your job, and to understand children you have to play and engage with them because that's the age that they're at. So we've done some play therapy training with them over the summer that they really valued. And we've re-emphasised direct work with children and young people. If a young person likes to play cricket and they want to go out and play cricket, that social worker is allowed to go and do that and find out how that young person is feeling. And if it's on a cricket pitch or a football pitch, that is valuable work. We're working towards an apprentice scheme for care leavers, and we've run a young women's wellbeing group for children and care leavers over the summer, and a football group for looked after children and care leavers. And we've also been involved with another local authority area, and we have matches now. It's not just about football, it's about what else do they want to know about. Might be about sexual health, might be about peer relationships. So part of it's about football, but part of it's about some learning for them as well. We've also over the summer run a garden party for families who have a disabled child. We felt that those families were particularly isolated because you don't go to the school gates, those children are on transport. So we invited finance officers in transport, colleagues as well, so that families could get to know a bit about what goes on in the background to their services being delivered. We've had some inspirational speakers, particularly from a care leaver quite recently, who is continuing to do some work with us, with our own young people, as well as with foster carers, to develop better knowledge. And the new IT system that is being developed, we're looking to have more effective recording of children's life stories. Sometimes with children, when you have paper information, they may be angry about particular things and they may rip them up and destroy them, but further down the line, they actually want to know what is happening for them. And so we're working to have a better method, really. And then just the final point there, we're looking at business cases, and I've just listed a few on the documents that you would have had to better establish a better framework. What we found is we're spending money where we don't need to be spending money. If we had a worker in post, arguably we would save some money by increasing the special guardianship orders that are available for young people. But what we're finding, particularly from those potential carers, is they feel that they wouldn't be supportive effectively and then don't want to go for a special guardianship order, which results in that young person potentially being in long-term foster care, which isn't necessarily the outcome. So the better outcome would be to have a worker who could support these special guardianship families. So there's lots of things that have been going on in children's services over the past few months, and that's really a bit of a whistle-stop tour, really, just to give you a bit of an idea. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Tracy, thank you very much, first of all, for your very honest appraisal. And I think you're extremely brave to have taken on the post. It must have been absolutely soul-destroying when you came in to see staff morale so low, to not even have the adequate resources. But it's obvious that there's been a significant amount of work that's been undertaken, and I congratulate you on all you've done so far, you and your team. I know this is for information purposes only and not scrutiny, but has anyone got any questions? Yes, Councillor.
I'd like to echo what you've said, Chair. Clearly, there was a greater need for change actually underlying some of this than we may previously have thought. And I think your commendation to Tracy for her open and an honest approach is very well made. I just wonder further down the track, maybe fairly soon, I don't know, whether there are opportunities that we could take as a committee or members of the committee, very informally, to actually meet people on the ground. I've found it very helpful in adult service areas, and it does occur to me that we could be trying to do this. It would show an interest. It would not be an inspection. It would be actually to show an interest and some appreciation.
I think children's staff would appreciate that, Councillor Farley. They feel that there is a bit of a, you know, I talk to them about select and say they can come and sit at the back, because I think there is a bit of a disparity really of their understanding, and that I think they would welcome you coming to have a look round and to see how things are going, and to ask questions of those practitioners that are dealing with child protection on day in and day out basis.
Well, if we could sort of agree that, and then subsequent to the meeting try and find a way or ways to do it, I would be very, very, very pleased.
Yes, I agree, Councillor Farley. I think that would be really good. And also it could be seen as being supportive of the staff, which I think is absolutely vital. So perhaps we could get together sometime, and it won't be at this moment, but anyway. Thank you. Yeah. Oh, yes, Councillor Powell.
Yes, I want to say I'm so sorry to know that you had this time when you were all so down and things weren't working very well, and it's difficult to get things together. And it must be a relief to you now to have things working and coordinating so well, and I hope it continues. And I too would like to be involved if you can find a time for us. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. We, although I feel we have come a long way in a relatively short space of time, I wouldn't want you to think that there isn't also still a lot of work to be done. And my challenge as leader of the service coming in really is not to put too much pressure on staff in too short a frame of mind of time, but keep the progress going, because otherwise you lose morale again. And you know, we've changed things like recruitment processes, and we do group interviews where the staff are involved in those interviews and explain to the candidates about how things are going. And for the first time, and I'm touching wood when I say this, because you know there might be a resignation now as I speak, I don't know, but we have got permanent social workers in post, and the staff are telling me that have been there a lot longer than I have, that's the first time for a long time. And we're finding that applications into Monmouthshire Children's Services have gone up substantially. The last time we had 17 applications for a post, and in all my years in social care you get maybe 1 or 2, but this has made a significant difference. And again, it's and we've asked recently, Simon Birch is the director of our service area, and I met with new staff quite recently asking them why they wanted to come to Monmouthshire, and the feedback was they'd heard out there that it was an interesting place to work. We think quite differently in Monmouthshire, that we focus on children and young people, and Simon and I were both very pleased to hear that was the word that was out there, and people were wanting to come to Monmouthshire.
Well done, Tracy, and congratulations to everybody in the department. And thank you very much. I'm sorry you've had to wait so long today. Yes, Simon, sorry, would you like a word?
Well, yes, I won't repeat all of the very positive comments which I share, because I do think it's great to receive that sort of presentation. I just wanted to remind CYP Select that obviously in a week's time we've got another meeting which is very much with the scrutiny hat on. So I think it's particularly important that we've had this sort of flavour today, so you understand where that's coming from, because I know that next week you'll be focusing in on a number of very specific areas. And as Tracy very wisely ended by saying, we've come a long way, but there are still a number of things on our agenda to put right. And you'll know that within the rather large papers, for which I apologise, you will see that Tracy's action plan for how she takes forward the things that relate specifically to looked after children begins to lay some of that out. So we're moving very briskly in the right direction, and there's much to celebrate. Equally, I know you'll want to hold us to account for other aspects when we meet next week. And there will be a follow-up inspection by CSSRW in November, which some of you know about, but Paul helpfully reminded me you may not all know about it. We'll talk about that next week. So we'll have a chance to really show the distance that we've travelled over the last year and 6 months. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much, Simon. Yes, the inspection's coming up, and yes, I think you'll find it's rather less than a week before the next CYP. Yes. Okay, thank you very much. Right, Nicola, I'm sorry you have drawn the short straw and you've got the last item of the day, but we're very grateful to you all the same, and I can't even find it now. Hang on a minute. Sorry. It just won't turn the page. Right, if you'd like to do the school balances for the children and young people, select, please. Thank you.
Hopefully this will be a fairly short agenda item. I'm sure you'll be very pleased with that after the long meeting we've had today. I think our training has answered most of the questions that we had on the last time. However, this report was asked for previously by Select. Looking at the school balances, it was originally looking around the budget balances. However, going forward, we've now had the month 3 balances, so I've incorporated them in this report. The report reflects balances over the last 4 years, and you'll see those attached in 3.1. You'll also note that although the number of schools in a deficit are reducing from 10 down to 6, the actual level of the deficit has gone up slightly from 415 up to 456,000. You will also note that we've had rising balances for our entire schools up until the last financial year, where it's dropped down to 988,000. I've given some explanations in the paragraphs that follow regarding funding and the formula, how we put the money out, but we went into some detail of that in our last select committee. I've also provided some comparisons with other authorities within Wales from the latest stats. We are still waiting for the final stats to come through for last year. That was all I wanted to say on the main body of the report. Obviously, I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. Just moving down to the table in Appendix 1, and I do apologise that it is quite small. This is the month 3 balances. You will have previously seen these figures when you've scrutinised the month 3 results. Again, just to note that the schools that are in a deficit are King Henry, Derryview, Llanfihangel, Criccorney, Castle Park, Chepstow, Landogo and Mountain House. I'm happy to report that with the exception of King Henry and Chepstow, all of them have recovery plans in place. King Henry have until the end of October to do a recovery plan, given that the new head teacher started in September. With Chepstow, we've had a draft recovery plan, and obviously we've got another meeting next week to finalise that recovery plan. That was a whistle-stop tour of the report. Obviously, I'm happy to take any questions that members might have.
Councillor Clark.
Not on this particular report, Nick, but you were aware last night at one of our meetings out with the population that the £60 million budget for education, the questions were asked, is it solidly ring-fenced, or is there an opportunity within it to reduce it in some way in order to help find this money we've got to find by the end of March? Now, I know the Welsh Government say it's protected, but I think I understood Peter Fox to say last night that we could reduce it by 3%. Am I right?
Yeah, first of all, obviously, recently, as in about the last 2 hours, we've actually been informed that the Welsh Government are expecting us to protect educational budgets by 0.6%.
Yeah.
So obviously that's a new challenge for us. I think what we're doing as a directorate, recognising with obviously the very big financial climate and position that we're in Monmouthshire, is we're actually working with our schools now to identify how they can contribute to making those savings. Nikki and myself and other colleagues have met with 2 clusters within the last 2 weeks, and we're actually looking at a forum going forward that we can actually explore some of the ideas that they're bringing forward, because they will need to obviously have big financial savings attached to them. So we're certainly looking at that, but obviously recognising we have got that protection from Welsh Government.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Right, I do know that this is, you know, it looks as though we're not scrutinising, but in fact we have been through it, and this is just coming forward for a document to keep us up to date and look at it. And we will scrutinise, particularly at the 6-month stage, isn't it? Where that will be looked at. Thank you so much. Thank you, Nicola. And thank you everybody else for attending and for staying so long. Thank you. See you in 20 minutes.